Hello and welcome back to Book and Page. We are on to another book, and our selection this time around is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which has two interesting facts. One, it's not known who the author is, so I can't really talk about the author, but I can talk about that other interesting fact, which is this is part of the Arthurian literature just existence. And I say it like that because I can't say anything like Arthurian literature canon or Arthurian literature cycle, because what I need to talk about before I can talk about Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is the fact that Arthurian literature doesn't really have a cycle or a canon that's recognized as the legitimate or correct version of Arthurian literature. And that's because Arthur and his round table of knights exist in this really weird connection point between history, myth, legend, entertainment, and then all the realms in between. So pseudo-history, pseudo-myth, anything like that. And before I get into that, I should note that Arthurian literature is the main idea of the matter of Britain, and there are three matters. Generally the matter of Rome, which is Romulus and Remus, and all the myths of the founding of Rome. The matter of France, which is more Charlemagne, but also again the foundings of France as a nation. And then the matter of Britain. And oddly enough, the matter of Britain as an existence, with the Arthurian legends involved, is really hard to say it's British in origin. A lot of Arthurian tales have elements of Welsh, Irish, Scottish, Celtic myths, which don't always, again, want to say, yeah, that's Britain, because we tend to, when we hear Britain, say, well, that's England, right? Which is not really fair to everybody else to help build this mythology. And a lot of the later works are actually French in origin. In fact, the Vulgate cycle, which is one of the major well-known cycles and accepted cycles of the Arthurian legend, is the French Vulgate cycle. So what we actually see happening is, while we consider it the matter of Britain, it's certainly a co-author thing that's occurring. So it's not anything like one Arthur or one author, necessarily. Everybody's sort of building up on this legend that started with folklore and this weird, again, history, pseudo-history, and just became so much more than that. So as we go through, you'll notice that we get to the point where there might be certain things that are considered Arthurian canon, but you're always going to be finding points, both ancient and modern, where those things aren't included. So I'm going to mention some of the big names, but I will not, of course, be mentioning all Arthurian literature. It's impossible to do so. If you're interested in knowing sort of the big, older versions, I will be connecting to a timeline of the sort of Arthurian legend, the history, the art, and the literature that was put together by Arthuriana, which is one of the big King Arthur academic magazines, academic journals. And they have a really well set up sort of chart where they give you the year, they give you the historical happenings, the literature that's occurring, the art that's occurring, and things like that. So you really get a chance to follow through on that, because there are people who point to historical events and say that Arthur did in fact exist. And it is an immense argument, like, between a bunch of areas of academics about whether or not Arthur ever existed as a human being, as a singular human being, as a collection of people that were all then brought under the umbrella of Arthur, or never really existed at all, just this legend started, and people kept building off of that. So it's very difficult to talk about Arthurian literature as a singular thing, simply because there's so many layers to it that you really have to be careful that you say, this is the section I'm referring to, because you really can't overall say that Mordred is the bad guy. Well, there are Arthurian legends that Mordred doesn't even exist in. You can't say Lancelot is the best knight simply because there was actually a point where Lancelot was invented, and there are prior Arthurian legends that don't have Lancelot at all. Same with the Grail Quest, which has become a big part of the Arthurian legend. Earlier versions of the legend do not have the Grail Quest. It is only when the Arthurian legend really became Christianized that the Grail Quest was brought in. You can find traces of the pagan elements, or the Celtic elements, that could have become the Grail very easily, but the Holy Grail in and of itself is not present in a lot of what we might consider the Arthurian canon, or literature included in the Arthurian canon. So, if you get into an argument with people about this, don't be surprised. It tends to be really normal that you're going to have disagreements about what author is more legitimate, if you're looking for a more historic version of Arthur, if you want to reject the idea of a historic Arthur at all and focus purely on the mythology, and you're definitely going to see that coming down even through the literature. So like I said, I'm going to talk about a few of the big ones, and talk about the tension that we're starting to actually see even from the beginning. Because you really get these two concepts of Arthur right even from the beginning of literature being written down. Because that's the other big thing. A lot of these stories there's a big difference between when they either happened or when they were first started to be told versus when they were written down. A lot of this stuff was word of mouth before we actually hit the point of people writing things down. So there's always going to be a gap, and that gap just tends to get bigger as we go through things. And eventually that historical element is dropped off, and most people are willing to just focus on Arthur as a myth and a story. But originally this was not true, and so we ended up having this pair of things sort of occurring at the same time, which is a writing of histories of Britain, as well as these folk tales among people that have the more mythic quality to them. So originally we have the Annales Cambriae, and I'm sorry from the beginning, I'm going to pronounce a lot of these names wrong. Unfortunately, linguistics is not my area of expertise. I will do my best, but like I said, I am sorry in advance. So the Annals are actually considered sort of the more legitimate history of Britain that are being written as we go through, and they don't tend to go into a lot of detail. They tend to just refer briefly to events that occurred, with the understanding that the people around already know about this, because time-wise we are significantly closer to the events that are being recorded. So you're assuming that people either knew about it because they were young enough and are still living, or they knew about it between 1 and 2 generations. So with the Annals, we actually have 2 mentions, notably of Arthur, and that's 2 major battles, which is the Battle of Camlann, which historically is argued to have occurred circa 485, and the Battle of Camlann was Britain expelling the Saxons, and it was enough of a defeat for the Saxons that we do see a significant time period before the Saxons attempt to invade Britain again. And there is a name attached to it that a lot of people argue is the sort of Romanized Latin version of Arthur, which is Aurelius. And Aurelius, we can sort of pinpoint, had to have been a real person. This battle had to have occurred. But where, when, and who, yeah, right? So we have a reference here to this battle happening, and this battle does become attributed to Arthur. We have a second battle mentioned as well, which is the Battle of Camlann, where Arthur and Mordred are said to have died. And this is sort of the start of the the dark day, the doom day of Mordred and Arthur going at each other. But the annals, again, are very short and very to the point. So historically, maybe something like this happened, but it doesn't say if they were on opposing sides and killed each other, if they were on the same side and they were fighting somebody else. None of that's really known. It's just, this is the battle name, these are the big names involved, and trying to piece it together from there gets very frustrating. But the annals are not the only historical accounts that we have. They're just the ones historically closer to the events that are supposedly happening. And they're certainly not making full arguments about how fantastic all of these things are. As we go through the histories, you'll notice you're certainly getting those historical aspects mixed with mythological ones. So we also have Gildas, who wrote his history circa 529, and you see from there we've already got like another 30 years in between. Bede completed his in 731, and that's a historical significant like date jump. That's several hundred years. William of Malmesbury, circa 1125. So you see, literally these are some of the first things that are happening, where historically Arthur's being mentioned, and the time jump between them is significant. And then, of course, we have Geoffrey of Monmouth. And Geoffrey of Monmouth's The History of the Kings of Britain is sort of the big history that a lot of people know in reference to Arthur, because it gives us Merlin as a child of the devil and dragons and these really mythological things that are becoming involved in the history that really allow then the branch off to the mystery side of things. So I do have the History of the Kings of Britain, because as much as it's a history of many kings of Britain, its Arthurian elements are so important that he is often studied in, like, you know, Arthurian legends. Because his history has become so much pseudo-history that it is a question of how much he actually helped build the Arthurian legend rather than portray a historical Arthur. But what's interesting is before we even get to Geoffrey of Monmouth's history, I mentioned, of course, that there's folktales that are happening along the same lines about Arthur, less historical. Again, they're the folktales, the tales we tell ourselves about our past to help us understand things. So what we actually have then, as these histories are being written, is we start getting the writing of Welsh tales, Celtic tales, Irish tales, things like that, including the bringing together of the four branches of the Mabinogion. And this is a sort of a weird one because it's definitely like Welsh tales, but then Arthur's somehow become involved in here. Now, he's usually not the main character, but he's certainly a king. He's a well-respected king, and he's willing to help people out. A lot of times somebody else is the main character, but they'll come to Arthur or some of his knights for assistance. So, already from the beginning, because the Mabinogion came together about 1050, so again, like, before this point, and this is when it was written down, not when the story started, but we're already seeing this idea that Arthur may not be the main character, but he's starting to become so well known that he's infusing other tales. Maybe originally a lot of these tales didn't involve Arthur, but Arthur became such a well-known character that it made sense to include him. And there are a lot of people that argue for that idea in practically everything. Even if it's historical, and there are historical people who did these events, Arthur has become such a big name that they just get subsumed into Arthur and disappear into this legend. So along with the histories, we're starting to get the folk tales, and we're starting to get things written down. And from here, things just explode for a while. There are many, many authors writing different aspects, writing about different knights. One of the big ones, of course, is Tristan de Troyes from France, who writes 5 Arthurian legends. Lancelot is one of his more well-known because it is arguable that he actually invented the character of Lancelot. We aren't seeing him as a knight before. We can maybe look back and say, we can look at certain names in lists of names and say that could have arguably transformed in the way languages do into Lancelot. But we definitely start having the Lancelot, Guinevere, Arthur triangle arrive thanks to Chrétien de Troyes. And that's sort of the interesting thing, because Lancelot's become such a major part of the Arthurian literature that we want to say he was there from the beginning. And he's really not. Because the Arthurian literature, for us, doesn't really have a beginning. It is constantly changing, constantly being developed. In a lot of ways, you can even say a lot of this might be fan fiction. It's stories that you heard that you were like, I really want to put my own spin on this, and suddenly we have Lancelot and Guinevere, which just then perforated the rest of the Arthurian literature. And Lancelot and Guinevere and Arthur as a love triangle that eventually destroys them all is a relatively well-known part of Arthurian canon. And it becomes so much so that if later writers don't include it, they might be called out as inauthentic. They always have to address it in some way. Even if it's a more subtle way, it needs to be addressed, because people are so willing to point at it happening in earlier Arthurian legends that they forget that eventually it had to have been created itself. We get a lot of Tristan myths and versions coming through from 1175 to 1191, and this is a bunch of different ones. And again, Tristan, in all likelihood, started out as his own character that eventually got subsumed into the Arthurian character, which is why he's a Cornwall knight who's over there, and then kind of comes into the court, but he has his own story occurring. And it's because he likely started separate from that. Same with Percival. We start having Percival show up, and Percival will eventually become a really big part of the Holy Grail quest. But how much of that started as his own story and then just got hooked onto King Arthur because King Arthur was so big that it's a lot easier to invent characters in association to legends that are already known, or pick a name off a list and give them a backstory. Boom. Cool, let's do it. So we really are seeing this development of a myth that isn't just about Arthur anymore. It really is about all these other heroes that are connected by the Round Table. Arthur might be the king, but he very quickly becomes not the main person of his own stories. Sure, he has his own moments, and we'll see this especially true in some of the later sort of full versions of the Arthurian tale, like Sir Thomas Malory's The Morte d'Arthur. Not the first one to talk about Arthur and his death, not the first one to be called The Morte d'Arthur, but Sir Thomas Malory is definitely one of the more well-known ones, because he attempts to talk about the entirety of Arthur's life, from his birth, and even prior to his birth, until his death. So it's sort of books like these that suddenly are the ones people point to as the full legends, because it is trying to bring all of these disparate ones that only talk about, well, Lancelot, or Gawain, Welsh ones talking about Owain, things like that, and put them all into one coherent story that occurs over everything. So this is often going to be a version of the story that people are reading. Same with the French Vulgate, that starts to put things more fully together. And the Morte d'Arthur includes a lot of the things that became well known. It includes Lancelot. He's awesome. It includes the Grail Quest. It includes Lancelot's son Galahad, who again seems to have appeared out of nowhere to make up for the failings of this character that Sir Thomas Malory seemed to really like. He really does seem to like Lancelot in this. So we've suddenly got this creation all the way through, and this one's coming, we have a more firm date, this is 1470. So like, you can see, again, the difference that we actually have moving from 1050 to 1470. This is just a massive expansion over years that we actually have this occurring. And it's never a single one. The one we're going to be doing, which is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, is dated to 1400, so only 70 years before Sir Thomas Malory's work. So what we're actually seeing is this full formation of the Arthurian tales. And these are the older ones, because what actually happens is there's a bit of a gap. People lose interest in Arthur. He's not addressing what people need to have addressed anymore. Because that's the other thing. You'd see the themes change from these epic quests to romance and how to be chivalrous and things like that. And then suddenly Arthur can't help them the way they need help. So there's a gap. And then it comes back. We have books like S.H. White's The Once and Future King. And maybe you've only heard of his first one, which is The Sword and the Stone. The Once and Future King is the combination of all 5 of his books. And that's... We've suddenly got modern... Well, more modern. There's always going to be a debate about where's modern, where's postmodern, whatever. More modern authors who are writing about Arthur. Some of them in the idealized form, which is what I find The Once and Future King really is. Some of them just trying, you know, to summarize more modern language. Rosemary is a really good person if you are looking for sort of the basic Arthurian story that's come to be accepted without having to try and read Sir Thomas Malory's writing, right? So we have things like this. And then we also have darker versions. People trying to look at the fact that we have this love triangle that's no longer acceptable and trying to deal with that. The Myths of Avalon, which I am still in the process of reading because it is a big book, really takes on the female aspect of these stories, which had fallen by the wayside for the most part. Arthur and his knights became so important that Guinevere just sort of became this body that was there, and if she was considered anything, it was a bad thing because of the love triangle. Same with Morgan Le Fay. Well, the Myths of Avalon tries to see, well, how would these women have been reacting in these circumstances that have pushed them into corners? How much autonomy did they have, and how much was actually their choices versus just what they had to do to survive? So Arthur, as a figure in literature, isn't a canon. I mean, there are certainly stories and aspects that are now more accepted, but from the very concept of him, it's definitely more of this creation myth that we use to help address issues of our own time. So as we continue to use Arthurian myths, those myths are going to change. Because we want to address more modern warfare, more modern relationships between men and women, and men and men, and women and women, right? So what actually happens is, rather than saying this is exactly how the story goes and getting called out if you ever change anything, we are definitely seeing a more Homer-Virgil relationship that even we can have with this mythology, where we as creators can come in, read everything, and then develop things more fully in ways that we want to do so. We're not constrained by what the author wanted, because there is no singular author. And even those authors, you are seeing this creative aspect where they're taking something of what they liked about the Arthurian story and creating so much more from it. So a lot of people, the Arthurian legends, it's a sandbox to play in. You get the chance to be so much more creative because you can go back. Maybe I want to talk about the female aspect, but maybe I also want to talk about an Arthur that was prior to having Lancelot as the main knight? What about the knights that got pushed aside? And that's, in fact, a little bit of what we actually see with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Because Lancelot coming in and becoming the major knight, he pushes aside a lot of people, Kai and Gawain included, who did have further roots than Lancelot did. So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, well, this is a knight I want to hear more about. He's the more human knight. So let's explore a story about him. And that's something that you can actually do with the Arthurian legends. You can pick and choose as you prefer. Now, I am a lover of these stories, so I am definitely not the type of person who will tell you to just pick and choose what you want to know. Dive in, go for it, read as much as you want. Sure, you're going to find some that you don't really like. You're definitely going to find some that have antiquated ideas, and that's something you risk reading older books. But the Arthurian legends, even if people like Tolkien want to argue are not the matter of Britain, they are a massive literary branch that has to be acknowledged, and you really should explore. So, with that said, let's get exploring with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. A nice little one, so a nice little taste, so you don't get too overwhelmed with all of the other big textbooks. If you are more interested in trying to learn historical aspects of Arthur and things like that, my other recommendation for you, though like I said we'll be studying Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and not this text, would be A Brief History of King Arthur, The Man and the Legend Revealed. I quite enjoyed this text, and it gives you some idea, without being too terribly long, about how the Arthurian legend swallowed up probably a lot of other historical people, and how it became the legend that it was. So, again, a nice introduction to both the literary and historical Arthur that ended up just ballooning into texts like these. So, I'm going to get reading, and I hope you do too. See you next time.